This is The Inner Life of Liberalism. I'm Jason Cannon. We've got a very fun show for you today because I get to interview my co-host, Aaron Ross Powell, about his new ongoing book project. Aaron has been thinking for a very long time about the relationship between personal and public flourishing. And to all of our great excitement, he's been working on putting that thinking into a monograph. I've already learned a lot from the manuscript, and I'm sure that you'll find Aaron's thoughts to be memorable too. As always, our supporters can listen to an extended cut of the interview at our website, liberalism.org, and this is one of those extended cuts that you really won't want to miss. I hope you enjoy the show. Aaron, tell me about this book project.
So this book, which right now the working title is Delight in Difference, is the result of kind of the same realization that led to this podcast. That for years I've been writing essays, most of them on my blog at aaronrosspowell.com, and realizing they were all kind of writing around this one topic, coming at it from different directions. And that topic was what we talk about on this show, or at least a version of it, namely what it's like to experience liberalism from the inside and what it's like to experience illiberalism from the inside, and the perspectives, values, beliefs that lead to an illiberal politics and a liberal view on society, and why the alternative is better. And so the book came together because I was going through all the essays I had written over the last several years, particularly as you and I were having the deeper conversations that led to the launching of The Inner Life of Liberalism, and pulling together around that theme and then rewriting into a short, it'll probably be 120, 150 pages. It's not a big book, book about this called Delight in Difference. And so it's my take on what I see as a primary driver of a liberalism in society, which is people who are unable to find delight in difference, or are fearful of difference, skeptical of difference, and how that then motivates an illiberal worldview and an illiberal politics as a result.
I really like the title. Why do you think it's important for us to not just accept difference or maybe tolerate difference, but actively take delight in it?
It's more fun. For one, I mean, if you're gonna spend your life in a world where you're constantly encountering difference, which you are to one degree or another, it's inescapable. But certainly if you live in the modern, interconnected world, you're going to experience people who are different from you. And if your reaction to that is fear or resentment or anger or just skepticism, you're going to make yourself miserable. And I think that was another kind of driver of like the essays that led to this book, the understandings that led to this book, was watching how many people seem to be miserable and not realize it, and how much of their misery is grounded in just being mad that there are people in the world doing things different from them. You know, there's a lot of stories people tell about how did we get to this current political moment? How did we get to this reactionary or populist or culturally right-wing backlash that now controls the federal government and has taken over governments around the world, you know, is threatening to take over. And you live in the UK, you're watching looming elections that may do exactly this. There's a story you can tell that there are people out there who just don't like difference. They don't like diversity. They don't like being exposed to the unfamiliar, the weird, just anything that's out of the ordinary for them. And one of the things that happened in the modern world is we got a lot more exposure to that. So if you live in the small town in America, it used to be like maybe you occasionally hear what those weirdos in the coastal cities were up to. But now, man, like the TV stations you're watching, the radio you're listening to is constantly telling you about those weirdos. You know, I remember that there was the panic around Drag Queen Story Hour for a little while, which is not all that common. This wasn't happening all that often. It wasn't happening anywhere near the people who were really mad about it. And yet, for a moment, they were just like the greatest threat to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and our children's well-being was that there might be somewhere in the world a dude in a dress reading a book to kids. And this wasn't a threat to anyone. The kids were all fine with it. It was hundreds of thousands of miles away. And yet, it was something that people were worked up about in a way that was creating anxiety and stress and misery in their own lives. And it was crazy. It was just crazy. And I think that that is a microcosm of this broader story of how we got here, is people are exposed to difference in ways that they haven't been before. And at some point, they just get really mad about it. And they don't like it, and they want to shut it down. And they vote for people who claim they will shut it down, who will put things back to the way that they were or that they imagine they used to be. And you get this illiberal political moment. And so much of my writing and my work on my prior Reimagining Liberty podcast was about that, was about pushing back, I think, on that attitude and saying instead, like, there is difference in the world. And if you can convince yourself, persuade yourself, habituate yourself into thinking that it's awesome, then you're not going to go to illiberal politics, but also you're going to enjoy the world more and you're going to enjoy your life more. Like, it's just not fun to sit there. We all have the experience of like doom scrolling. It sucks. The anxiety of doom scrolling. Like, to intentionally just create a world for yourself where you're just mad at everything in it all the time is a profoundly unwise and undesirable way to live. And yet, it seems to be particularly common.
How much of this do you think is something that we are acculturated to, or that we acculturate ourselves to? And how much of it do you think is just kind of built-in personality? Because it certainly seems like some people are more open to experience. That's one of the major factors in psychology that researchers look at. That seems to be a pretty durable feature of people's inner lives. And yet, I think you're pointing to something that is really crucial here, which is that it's not like whatever nature and nurture sort of early provision of openness that we arrive onto the planet with sets in stone how we react to cultural change. But there are practices that we can engage in that make us better and worse consumers of difference and more or less likely to be able to do the kind of delighting that you're describing. Do you have a kind of rough and ready sense of how and where the practices kind of take over for the natural human bent that we might have?
I think on the one hand, it's impossible to know exactly how much is nature versus nurture. I think even if we did know, it would vary a lot between people. We do know that it exists. So the scholar Karen Stenner has written about the authoritarian personality, and she finds that I think it's roughly 30% of people have what she calls an authoritarian personality type, which does not mean that they are authoritarians, but it means that they're essentially at risk of being triggered into authoritarianism or into support for authoritarianism. And the triggers tend to be diversity and or rapid change around them, that at some point, like, it just becomes scary and they don't like it, and then they can snap and support authoritarian parties or candidates or policies or whatever it happens to be. And that 30% seems to be relatively fixed. But that doesn't mean that they're authoritarians, right? They can be triggered into it. And so there is a opportunity for practices to protect against it if they are intentionally cultivated. And so I think by way of analogy, I used to hate public speaking. I was terrified of it. I remember taking a speech class or taking a class in high school where we had to give a speech, a 10-minute speech. And it was like the most stressed I've ever been in my life to stand up in front of 20 of my peers and talk for 10 minutes about, I don't remember what the topic was, but a topic that I knew well. And it was awful. It was absolutely awful. And that's something a lot of us feel that way. You know, public speaking is one of the most common great fears that people have. But the thing about that fear of public speaking is that you can, to some extent, just decide you want to get over it. That you can take steps intentionally if you are someone who says, I am very nervous speaking, I'm terrified speaking, but I want to do it, or I need to do it for my job, or it's a skill I want to develop. You can decide to teach yourself out of it by, say, just doing it, or thinking about the sources of the nervousness, or practicing or putting yourself in situations where you have to speak to more people, or taking opportunities to, I don't know if you want to irritate your friends, soliloquy in front of them. But whatever it is, that practice or set of practices enables you to get over that fear. And in a lot of cases, and this was certainly the case for me, come to actually enjoy doing it, such that it's no longer something that you fear, and it's not even something where you say, I don't like this at all, but I can put up with it, but instead is something that you seek out or enjoy doing, or certainly don't turn down opportunities to do. And I think something similar can play out in a liberal society, that if you react negatively to the kind of diversity or dynamism or what feels like social chaos around you because of both that diversity and dynamism, you can sure get yourself to tolerate it. You can say, look, I'm not going to react negatively to this, or I'm going to kind of grin and bear it. But you can also come to enjoy it, and you can intentionally set out to teach yourself to come to enjoy it by stepping out into it, by trying new things, by exposing yourself to new things in ways that are not exceedingly threatening, not dangerous, not where things are going to go wrong, but just where you're stepping out of that comfort zone and you're trying it and you're exposing it to yourself. And this is something people who live in cities get this naturally. You kind of can't escape the diversity and dynamism of liberalism. But even if you're raised in a rural community, you can just make an effort to shift your perspective. And the upshot is, just like I can come to enjoy public speaking, I think if anyone who sets their mind to it, if they have this natural aversion to the messy diversity of liberalism, can actually just through practices teach themselves, acculturate themselves, habituate themselves into just flat out enjoying and cherishing that aspect of a liberal society.
That seems right to me. And one of the reasons why you and I wanted to start this project was because we both had this sense that even if someone has really good liberal principles for their politics, and even if they have worked out a killer set of institutions that can protect all of the equal liberties that we find so essential, principles and institutions aren't enough, and that they require a sort of character and a set of practices to constantly be revivifying them and giving them new life and supporting the motivations that actually lead us to do the right thing and support the right institutions, because otherwise the whole thing just sort of falls flat. And I think one of the really incisive parts of the manuscript that I was lucky enough to get to read before it's actually in print is that you kind of have some avatars, and you're very charitable in not naming names. It's clear that you have some people in mind who were champions of really good principles for a long time. And then in the past several years, and, certainly in the post 2016 era, I've just kind of lost it. And in the book, you trace that to an inability to appreciate difference in that way. So can you just think out loud about what you think is common to a lot of those people who seemed to be really committed liberals and seemed to have their views in a really solid place for so long? Many of these people are like illustrious scholars, some of the most cited names, and so people who are very smart and who know their stuff, and then kind of went astray. To unpack that for us, what's that dynamic?
I think there's a handful of things going on there. So the paradigmatic version of this is someone who was deeply committed to liberal principles and institutions, limited government, individual freedom, freedom of expression, etc. We list them all out and rhetorically talked in that language a lot, and could articulate comprehensive arguments grounded in rights or utilitarianism or whatever, pick your moral philosophy for these positions. And then with the rise of right-wing reaction, particularly with the first Trump administration, then Trump's campaign for his first term, and then continuing through to today, some of them there was a clean break, and they just were like all on board with this stuff as soon as it showed up. But there's also the people who you kind of watch them talk themselves into supporting a liberalism by saying, well, that the other guys are just as bad, even if the rhetoric is a little bit different, or, well, we might get some good stuff out of this. And then it was kind of a frog boiling situation as they just became more and more and more on board with it. And I think there's a lot of things going on, or a lot of causes leading to that, but they all coalesce around this inner life of liberalism argument, which is, it's about kind of the perspectives and like what you see, what you choose to see, what you notice, what you view as morally salient to your project and others' projects, and so on. And so part of it is there were people who I think just never believed what they were saying in any deep sense or any embodied sense. That the language of liberty was essentially, I feel like other people are threats to me. That if other people have power, political power, concentrated political power, they will use it to harm me or take away the things I like or drive my preferred lifestyle underground or whatever it happens to be, which might have been true, it might not have been true. People do use political power in those ways. We're watching a lot of it play out right now. And so they viewed a system of liberty as essentially a way to protect themselves from others. I want to be left alone. The best way to be left alone is if we have a system that leaves everyone alone. And there's nothing wrong with that position, right? All of us would like to be free to live the way that we want to live. The problem is that I think for at least some of the people who kind of made this pivot that we witnessed, it turned out that when it looked like political power could be used to further their own ends or to force their views upon others, or to drive out views or behaviors or lifestyles that they found distasteful, suddenly they were all on board with it. So it was basically, I'm opposed to political power when I view it as a threat to me, but if I think I can wield it against my enemies, now I'm on board with it. And so the rhetoric just dropped away. But the underlying motivation remained the same. It was power is bad when it afflicts me, it's good when I can afflict others. That's not all of them, though. I think there's also there's a lot of people who kind of always had lines they drew in terms of which cultures were acceptable, which behaviors, which subcultures. And at some point it just snapped for them. Like, things got too weird. They always didn't really like those, whether it was people on the left or people on the right or whatever it happens to be. And so the rise of authoritarian populism kind of coincided with the world getting too weird for them to want anymore. And so they talked themselves into getting on board with it. I think that one, the charitable argument for their position is this: it's not difference, it's harm that we're watching. These behaviors are harmful, they're damaging, they're corrosive to society, they're breaking down bonds, the traditions that are being overthrown actually were necessary for a liberal society or a society of liberty to persist. And so this isn't really about the politics turned to now aren't really about limiting freedom. They're about driving out the forces that are destructive, corrosive to freedom and a free society. And again, that's not an incoherent position, right? There are certainly ideologies that can destroy liberalism, and if they're acute enough, you can make an argument that a liberal state has a legitimate interest in suppressing them or defending against them or whatever it happens to be. And I think where the problem rose was the expansiveness of what counted as being harmful. The view that a lot of things that simply weren't by any reasonable measure harmful kind of got roped into crossing that line into being legitimately suppressed or punished or driven out. And then I think there's also just a group who there's kind of cultural clashes that play out here. I don't like the people who I find bothersome or irritating or have views that vex me, and it's kind of fun to see them punished or driven out. And I think a lot of that comes from, and I think this is another part of these practices that we talk about as being so important, is a lot of that comes from hanging out in the wrong communities. You can hang out in communities that inculcate cruelty or delight in cruelty or present and dehumanize the people that you don't like. And then everyone is agreeing with that. And so then you just kind of come to believe these entirely wrong-headed, whether intellectually or culturally or personally, views about the other. And the more time you spend in those communities, the more incapable you are of interacting well and thoughtfully with people outside of them, which then just reinforces your membership in those communities. I think this is one of the real harms that social media can do, is that social media really reinforces those sorts of values, and then has a tendency just structurally to kind of trick us into thinking that our weird community is actually the whole world. That you're following 500 people on Twitter and seeing all their posts, but to you it looks like that's just what's happening on Twitter, and that Twitter is huge, and so therefore your views are really widespread. And the same thing happens. I'm much more active. I spend my time on Blue Sky, and Blue Sky definitely has that same thing, although with a different political and social valiance than Twitter or X does. But yeah, like you just kind of come to really, the difference turns into dehumanization, and reinforces a threat assessment view of anyone who's not like you and your tribe.
I'd like to end on a personal note. What's the practice that you have adopted in your own life that has best promoted this kind of delight in difference?
I think there are two. If I can expand your question out a bit, there are two. One is, call it personal, and one is, call it epistemic. So the epistemic one was making the decision. We all exist in ideological tribes to some degree. You can't escape ideology entirely. But those tribes tend to reinforce views about alternative tribes. And I called this, in something I wrote a while back, the Quillette effect. There's a publication, kind of a center-right publication called Quillette, and every now and then what they'll do is they'll publish something that's like an explainer on some kind of leftist theory, political theory, social theory, so critical race theory or postmodernism, or take your pick. And it's usually written by someone who is skeptical of that theory, sees it as dangerous or stupid or both. But it's written in kind of the register of an explainer. And so if you don't really know what postmodernism is, or you don't really know what critical race theory is, but you know it's something that's like, those people over there outside of my tribe are really into it, you might read the Quillette explainer, think you understand. And the explainer has told you it is, in fact, you were right to think that it was stupid and evil, stupid and dangerous. And so now you think like, okay, I was right. I know enough about it to confirm my beliefs, and I move on. When in fact, there's like a realization you might have if you explore this more, that most ideas believed by large numbers of smart people, like there can be bad ideas and there can be ideas that are wrong or lead to poor consequences, but they're typically not as stupid as you might think, or as poorly argued for, because otherwise lots of smart people would not, be into them. And so part of it was, I'm going to make a real effort to like go to the source on ideas that are outside of my tribe or outside of my standard epistemic circles, and read them or follow proponents of them, and still often, most of the time, like disagree with, but have a richer understanding of different ideas and ideologies and perspectives, and try to get, to the extent that it's possible, more of a sense of what those feel like from the inside and what the actual motivations are for them from the inside. And I think that helps a lot. It's a habit most people who engage in like politics don't do, or engage in social thinking don't do. The other one, and this goes to like my Buddhist practice, and this is the personal, is what's called metta meditation. And this is, so most of the time if you learn meditation, it's focus on your breath, right? Like just notice the breath going in, notice the breath going out, try to experience the fullness of the breath. When your mind wanders, as it inevitably will, gently bring your attention back to the breath. Metta meditation, and there are a lot of different versions of this in different Buddhist traditions. Some go by different names, but the core idea of it is, instead of trying to cultivate awareness of an object, the breath or whatever it happens to be, you're trying to cultivate a certain kind of internal feeling or perspective towards others. And so it's sometimes translated as loving kindness or loving friendliness, or goodwill. But the idea is you settle in, and starting with yourself, you just wish yourself well. Like, may I be happy. and try to mean it and like experience the feeling of actually meaning goodwill, and then expand it out to a friend or someone you're close to, and expand it out even more. And eventually you're just sitting in this kind of feeling of goodwill towards everyone. Like you're wishing that they find happiness and meaning it. And it feels really, really good. And I actually think it's probably a better way to learn meditation than breath for most people, because part of the problem with developing a meditation habit is that it feels like work and it feels unenjoyable, but metta feels really good and feels good much more quickly, typically, than breath meditation does. And it still is developing aspects of attention and focus and so on. But I think metta meditation, sitting in that feeling of goodwill, creates mental habits of a baseline of goodwill towards everyone, such that when you encounter difference or you experience people in a social scenario, your kind of standard disposition is more one of goodwill than irritation or skepticism. And that can be overridden, like maybe this person genuinely is bad and you should not respond positively to them, but it kind of resets the baseline in a way that I feel like, especially the amount of time that a lot of us spend online, that sets a very different kind of baseline. It sets like a baseline of ill will is the habit of particularly social media or a lot of political media. So metta meditation, I think, is the other one that just is about shifting your fundamental perspective on the world to one that is more open and expansive and inviting, and just you are gaining pleasure by hoping that other people are happy. And that's pretty neat.
This is normally the slot where I'd say to go buy Aaron's book in your favorite bookstore, but it's still a work in progress, and we won't rush him. What you can do, though, is share your questions and comments about the book in this episode at liberalpractice.org and our new subreddit at r/liberalpractice. The Inner Life of Liberalism exists thanks to the generosity of our listeners. Supporters gain access to extended cuts of interviews just like this one, along with several bonus episodes throughout the year, including our upcoming conversation on the importance of the French philosopher Sophie de Grouchy. You can learn more about it supporting us, explore previous episodes, and nerd out with me and Aaron at liberalpractice.org. We hope to see you there soon.